Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're going to be finishing what I started, and that happens to be returning to the Growlanser series. So when it comes to all the games that were released in North America, I reviewed all of them except for this one, and that being Growlanser 5, Heritage of War. Also, it's called the Growlanser Generations, which is kind of confusing given that we've already had one called Generations, which combines 2 and 3. But yes, this is the 5th one, and it's one I've been really wanting to play for some time, but, you know, just things have just been getting in the way of all that. But just like all the other games, the game was developed by Careersoft, and it was published by Atlas in North America, and in Europe it was actually published by Rising Star Games, if you could believe that. And it came out in 2006 for Japan, 2007 for North America, and 2008 for Europe, so damn, really late release there. But yes, I'm not going to repeat everything that I've talked about with all the other games because I've already talked all about them, but of course at the end of this video, I'll kind of get into like my thoughts about like my current ranking of the series and whatnot. So I'm just going to assume that you pretty much know what this series is, and in case you haven't, well, there's a lot of catching up to do. So as always, let's talk about the game's story first, but one thing I'll get out of the way is that just because this is the 5th entry doesn't mean you have to play all the games in order. You can actually jump into this one first if you really felt like it. So it begins that there is 3 countries at war on an island, and those countries happen to be Ceriltia, Grand Gale, and Naelern. And the reason why they are at war with each other is because there is actually some soil that belongs to the Naelern land where it is actually still fresh, where all the rest of it is actually like gone to complete shit. Because the land is slowly dying, and parts of the reason why it's slowly dying has to do with a bunch of creatures that come up from the seas called Screepers. And these Screeper monsters are very deadly, and there's many different class types for them as well. So as these wars are happening around the land, the first character you play as is named Seldus, and he was a guy that grew up as an orphan traveling with someone named Vanette, who was also an orphan, and their orphanage actually burnt down due to a bunch of shitty people during the war, and for that reason, they actually want to put an end to it. So as they're traveling, they end up meeting another character named Isaac, who also wants to put an end to war as well for his own reasons. And that being that his family was killed. So how exactly are these characters going to put a stop to war? Well, apparently there was an old legend that was hidden inside a ruin where there was this mechanism that was able to make peace. And they try and look for it, and they did, and they end up finding a Pothradian, who are a race of characters that kind of look like monkeys with straw hats. At least that's the best way I can make out of them. And the one they found, his name is Professor Pernagi, so yeah, so he's like really smart and shit. And as much as I'd like to go in depth about what the Pothradians are, it would take a while, so I'm just gonna sum it up and say that their race can actually like find like the ley line around the land, and what the ley line is that it basically what gives them like life. So pretty much they have like different habitats like all around wherever there's a ley line is. Alright, so you got that? Alright, so Professor Pernagi ends up showing them that there's this ancient device in here, and that happens to be a giant laser cannon called the Admonisher. And he tells them that this Admonisher can actually still run, but it just needs a lot of different materials and whatnot. So eventually they have to go and find all the different materials. And eventually they do, and once they build it up, the other countries find out that there is another third party who is working against them and they're trying to take it down. But of course they don't know that it's a laser cannon, they just knew that it's just some other weapon. So once they try and figure it out, Seldus and Isaac are at the control panel where they can press the button to shoot the laser. But of course, Seldus wants to shoot it at a mountain so therefore they can like, you know, not kill anyone. But Isaac on the other hand thinks that they should shoot it directly in the middle of the battle to let them know that they are a threat, and that if they continue to do any more battles, then, you know, they're gonna get shot by a giant fucking laser. So now all the other countries are scared shitless because they don't want to get shot by that thing, so now there is no wars ever again. There you go, guys, that's the entire story of this game. The end. Nah, I'm just kidding. This is actually the entire prologue, believe it or not. So what happens after is that they end up creating a federation called the Peace Maintenance Brigade, also known as the PMB. And like I said, the entire purpose of them is that they have to try to keep the peace and make sure that there is no wars happening, because if there is, then you know what's gonna happen, they're all just gonna get blown the fuck up. So now the game does a time skip of 20 years later, and this is where the real game begins, where all like the main characters are finally like, you know, getting introduced. Cause yes, Celdus and Isaac are very important characters, but you only play as them in the prologue. So the true main character of this game happens to be named Haschin? Yeah, Haschin? I don't know how the fuck to say it, but apparently in the Japanese version, his name is Zeon, so maybe I'll just call him that just because it's easier. Although not like it really matters, because you can actually rename him as whatever you want. That's just the default name that's given. So he grew up in a town called Worsley that ended up being attacked by some Screepers, and he almost died in the process, but he ended up being saved by the PMB, and when he was saved, he ends up getting some mysterious powers where he can actually weaken the Screepers. So now he officially works for the PMB, and because of his new power, he can actually fight off the Screepers. And some of the main other party members I'll go into is Cryus, who happens to be the son of Celdus. Yeah, I didn't mention this, but yes, during the whole prologue scene, Celdus and Vanette end up getting married and having a kid, and well, the kid ended up being Cryus, and he looks like a pirate. Not really sure why, but I mean, hey, I ain't complaining. I think he looks pretty awesome. But to sum him up though, he's pretty much like the main diplomat of the PMB. And then you got Malvina, who happens to be an officer who works directly under Isaac. And then there's Fanil, who happens to be a researcher for the PMB, and she's also a bit of a shut-in and is not very good at conversation. And then you have Randall, who happens to be like the dopest looking character in the entire game. Okay, but to be serious though, I really do love his character design a lot. And he happens to be a historian and archaeologist. And believe it or not, no, he does not work for the PMB, he actually does his own thing. And finally, there is a character named Corin who happens to be a fairy. So just like the fourth game, the main character also gets a fairy companion as well. And those are all the main characters that join your party. Of course, just like all the other games, there is a shit ton of characters, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'll mention a couple. Like from Ceriltia, you got Lady Sheris, and then from Grangale, you got Rufus, and then from Naylor, you have General Rockbind, who happens to look a little bit like a mix between Seitan from Final Fantasy VI mixed with Lemmy Killameister, which is pretty awesome. In fact, he's probably the manliest character in this entire game. So yeah, that sums up what you need to know about the story and like the basics of what you need to know about like some of the characters that mainly show up. And obviously I'm not gonna go like a deep dive into like spoiler stuff because I know this is a game that not a lot of people played when it came out, and I'm sure most people that are watching this and do want to play it are going to be playing it for the first time ever, so yeah, I'm not going to be going into that sort of stuff. But I can say that the story in this game does kind of remind me a little bit of the third game's story with the whole like planet is dying sort of concept, but I think they do a pretty interesting way with it, where, you know, they basically end all wars, so, you know, all the other games all have to do with like a bunch of battles and shit, where this one, like, they pretty much ended the entire process, but even though they ended all wars, there are other, like, problems that do end up coming up. And you know that there's going to be some chances that some of these other countries out there are going to try to start a war in some way without the PMB knowing. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stuff like that that does come appear with the game, and I thought it was pretty interesting. And we're 8 minutes into this video, and I haven't even talked about the gameplay yet, because yeah, there's a lot to say about that too, and let's talk about it right now. So let's talk about the combat first, because the combat in this game has made a lot of changes since the other games. So the 4 other games kind of have a tactical strategy feel to them, but without a grid, and everything was all done in real time. While this game, everything is still real time, but I feel like it doesn't really feel that much like a tactical strategy game anymore. Obviously, it still has a lot of the same stuff from the other games, like the whole wait meter, where like every time your character has to do an action, you had to wait for a little bit, and then they can perform it. While I find in this game, I find that the battles in it kind of almost feel like an action RPG, but not like your typical action RPGs like the Tales of series. No, I'm talking about like the ones like kind of similar to like Xenoblade, Final Fantasy 12, or a lesser known one, Magna Carta 2. And I have to say, the fact that they decided for the 5th game to change like the battle system so different like that is not only interesting, but it's also quite daring as well, because it could be good or bad, depending on the person and how you feel. So if you played all the other games like I did, and you really loved the battle system a lot, and then you jump into this one, there is a chance that you might not like the new battle system into it because it's just so different from all the other ones, but then there's also a chance that you might actually really love it a lot. And of course, whether you like it or not, you gotta give them credit for the fact that they even did something so risky of trying something new. So for that reason, that's why I'm kinda having a hard time trying to call this a tactical RPG, because like I said, it almost kinda doesn't feel like one anymore, even though it still has a lot of elements from them. But anyways, so after knowing all this, so the only character that you can directly control and move around all over the place is your main character, Zeon, or Haschin, or whatever. And all the other characters in your party will move around on their own, but of course you can still give them direct commands by either telling them to attack a certain unit, or to cast a certain spell, or use an item, all that type of stuff. But when their weight meter is up, and then their thing pops up telling you that, that you can direct command them again, and then you press circle, then they'll just do auto attack, where they'll just automatically do things on their own. And you can switch the AI functions with the start button and for changing it for every character. But I do feel that doing that for every single battle and doing it for every single character can be a little bit tedious, but it is there in case you want your characters to do auto attacks for very specific things instead of just, having them attack whatever the closest unit is. So yeah, the battle system has a lot of familiar elements from the other games, but also does make some interesting drastic changes, and of course I'll get into my own thoughts about them later. Also, another interesting change that they made was the equipment and knacks system in this game. So in the fourth game, you had the ring system where you equip different skills to the ring and then you can level them up, and it was actually pretty fun and very customizable. Well, this game takes it to a whole other level and adds even more customizations with this hexagon system. So you enter this menu by pressing square, and what this does is that it has these hexagons that have different skills, and you level them up, and then when you see the little arrows that point at the different ones, well, you can actually select that path, and when you're on that path, you'll be leveling up all these skills at once, and you'll also be able to use them at whatever level you can. And probably the best thing that I love about this system is that you're actually never wasting EXP with them, because let's just say you leveled up every single skill in a row, but you forgot to change it over to the next path. Well, the good thing is that when you change over to another path with skills that aren't leveled up yet, the EXP that you would have gotten that haven't leveled up your old path will actually carry over to the new one. Therefore, you don't have to worry about wasting EXP, and it also makes the grinding so much easier to deal with. In fact, that's actually one thing in general about the game that I do like better than the other ones, is that I feel there wasn't nearly as much tedious grinding you had to do in this game. Not only did I feel that leveling up the knacks, magic, and skills and whatnot felt they were a lot more easier to level up, but also just with the whole fact of what I just mentioned about the EXP carrying over to the next one, it just made things so much more easier to deal with. The only downside about the system is that sometimes when you do switch over to another path, sometimes you will lose a little bit of buffs on certain magics, but the good thing is though is that you can actually switch back to the other path in the middle of battle if you really wanted. So it never feels that you're truly losing anything out of it. And of course, another thing I should mention too about this system is that you can actually have items that can help you switch places between different skill sets or change the direction of the arrow and all that type of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of really in-depth things you can do with this system. Now, it may look confusing at first glance, but I personally never found it to be that confusing. But if there's one good thing about it as well that I can mention is that I feel you never have to spend that much time in this menu. I feel they made it pretty easy enough to navigate through it. So those are all the big major changes that they did with this game in terms of gameplay. Of course, a lot of the other stuff is the same, traveling to different towns, buying weapons and armor and items and accessories, and then of course there's also a lot of side content. In fact, they also brought back the whole fairy gimmick from the fourth game, but I feel in this game, I barely utilize it at all. Yeah, so to sum it up quickly, is that there's actually some fairy contests that you can take a part in certain towns, items, and you can actually level up Corin's like abilities. And I feel like in this game, I just didn't really like notice a big difference, but maybe I just didn't level it up enough, because in this game you actually have to pay money in order to like gain up her stuff, and sometimes like it was just taking a really long time to do. So yeah, I don't know, I'm sure there's some expert out there who will tell you that, like, oh, if you get her intelligence to, like, level 999, then, you know, you can, like, be, like, super OP in the game, but I don't know. I was able to complete the game just fine, even without dealing too much about it. But I figured I'd let you all know that it is back, but it may not be as, like, super important as it was in, like, the 4th game. Because I felt like in the 4th game, it really did make a big difference. So yeah, that sums up the big things you need to know about the gameplay. Obviously, I'm not gonna, like, repeat everything that I've said in, like, the other videos about, like, the gameplay and how it works, because, you know, we'd be here forever. And this video is already longer enough than it is. So let's get moving on and start talking about the other things, like the graphics. And the graphics in this game are a bit of a mixed bag. But let's talk about the good, and of course I have to mention the best part, the character art. So yes, my all-time favorite artist, Satoshi Urushihara, he's back again, kicking more ass than he ever did, by making some awesome art. And yes, I gush about him like a million times, so I won't say any more, but of course, it has to be mentioned every time. And I do really like the pre-rendered backgrounds quite a bit. I actually think they look really good in this game. In fact, I think they look even better than all the other ones. It's actually a pretty big improvement. Like, there's so many, like, areas and towns in the game that just look really nice. Like, I really love all, like, the different set pieces they created in here. But as for the character models, well, they have a bit to be desired for. Okay, so I'm actually a little bit mixed on the character models in the game itself. So yeah, they changed from going from 2D sprites to 3D models, and I'm okay with it as long as it's done right. But as for this game though, well, there are certain character models that look decent, and I will give them credit. They did try really hard to try to recreate Satoshi's art into these 3D models. Like, they really tried to put every single detail into them, and I can respect that. Like, I find that the main character, Zeon, I find his character model is probably one of the better looking ones, because they actually did a good job, like, putting in all those details, and it actually doesn't look like shit. And also Melfina, I thought, was done pretty well, too. I actually really like the way how her, like, wings on her hat, like, kind of, like, move around. But probably the biggest, like, offender of this issue has to be Randall, which, yeah, like I said, he's, like, my favorite looking character in the game, because, you know, he has, like, a dope top hat and whatnot, but unfortunately, his character model looks like a hot mess. I don't know what it is, but like, the proportions just seem really off on him, and I think a part of the reason is that, like, look at his, like, pink scarf. It just looks way too, like, big for him, and it just looks really fucking weird. But probably the most hilarious thing that makes it even more, like, funny and stupid is his run cycle. Yeah, he has, like, this running cycle where he runs like fucking Naruto or Sonic the Hedgehog, and it just looks so fucking funny. So because of this is kind of the reason why I'm kind of mixed on the character models, and there's also a couple other character models too that do look a little bit too messy for me. But despite of this though, it's not awful looking. Like, it could have looked a lot worse, but at the same time, I kind of wish they would have stuck with 2D sprites, or at least if they were going to stick with 2D sprites, at least, like, update them from, like, the 4th game and make them look even better and bigger. I think that would have looked really great, especially with the pre-rendered backgrounds, but oh well. Like I said, graphics aren't everything, but at least they did do a few things right. And now, as for the game's music, the music in this game is alright overall, but I can't help but feel it's very underwhelming, especially compared to the other games in the series. Like, all the games in the series up to this point had some really awesome soundtracks. Yes, even the first game, which I haven't played, I've heard the music in it, and it's pretty rad. And before anyone's wondering, yes, I know, I did talk some shit about the 3rd game's OST being a little bit more recycled and not having as much memorable tunes, but like I already corrected it before though, I do think number 3's OST is still good overall. And as for this one, yeah, it's definitely worse than number 3. So with that said, there is a couple decent tracks in the game. Like, I do really like the overworld theme. I do find that one is actually pretty nice and catchy. Some of the town themes are really nice. In fact, actually my favorite song in the entire game happens to be the town theme of Zerdok. It kind of has like this like horror PS1 vibes to it. At least that's what I get from it, and I really love it a lot. That's probably my favorite. But the rest are decent, fine, you know, they do the job just fine, and then there are some that are just kind of forgettable. Not awful, but just, you know, they're just kind of there and not really memorable at all. Also, another problem too with the music is that there's not a lot of songs on the OST either, so you're going to hear a lot of the same songs over and over and over again. So yeah, this is another OST that I wish there were more songs in the game. So yeah, we go from the 4th game's OST, which I said is like my all-time favorite in the series, and then we go to this one. Yeah, it's a pretty big drop. A little unfortunate, but overall, I can at least say it's not terrible, but it's okay on its own, but compared to the other games, yeah, it's the worst so far. Alright, and as for the game's voice acting, yes, this game actually has a lot more voice acting compared to the 4th game on PSP. And I think it's pretty good overall, but it does have its inconsistencies though. So just to name over a couple people from the cast, so you have Alan Sherman, you got Barbara Goodson, you got David Lodge, Julie Ann Taylor, Kirk Thornton, Kyle Hebert, Mary Elizabeth McLean, Patrick Sates, Wendy Lee, Sam Riegel, and even Yuri Lowenthal. So it does have a lot of people that tend to play in a lot of different Atlas games, which makes sense. And as I said, there's a couple voices in here that I do think like are pretty good and are well done, and then there are some that I think could have been a little better. Like, if I had to give praises to anyone, I would actually say Mary Elizabeth McLean playing Malvina was actually the best one. Also, Alan Shearman playing Dr. Randall was pretty awesome. He actually had a pretty cool voice for him. And Kirk Thornton playing Saldus was really great, though he was a lot better as him in, like, after the time skip, but he was still pretty good as him even when he was younger. But I think it's mostly, like, the random, like, minor characters, though. It's really, like, the weakest part of the voice acting. I thought those roles were definitely, like, the worst part. But as bad as they were, though, they weren't, like, so bad it's good or funny type of bad. They were just kind of bland bad. So yeah, not the good kind. But I will say this though, out of all the English dubs for the Growlanser series that I've heard, I do find this one is probably like the best one if we're talking about actual serious acting work. But it does lack the charm that the working design games had, because, you know, those ones had like some like goofy-ass voice acting that were just so hilarious, and I'll never forget them. But I can at least say that for Heritage of War, they at least put some like actual effort into the voice acting. Even though some of it was a little inconsistent, I do think like it is like more consistently better than all the other ones. Now, if you want to go out and buy this game, well, I'm sure as you know, during the time that we're living in right now, the prices of this game are probably going to be a lot more than they usually were, but yeah, cheapest I've seen it for was $80, and there was a bunch more that were way more, so yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not really surprised. But I do want to mention that for a very long time, every time I've seen this game around, like in stores, I always saw it for about like $20 to $30. In fact, I always thought it would be one of the more like easier to get games from Atlas for PS2, but no, apparently not anymore. So now, finally, let's get into my overall thoughts on Growlanser 5. So I can say that I actually really do like this game, but I'm unsure if I would say it's my favorite though, but I do think it is very solid overall. So as for the combat system being very different from the other games, so I do really like it. I do think it is like an interesting change, and I do enjoy it. Like, I do think it does make the battles even more faster than they already were, even though I never had a complaint with the battles being too slow in the other games. But this was a maneuver that was actually risky, but I ended up actually kind of liking it, because I'm not gonna lie to you guys, when I first started to play this game, I was kind of unsure how to feel about it, because I kept trying to play it like the other games, when yet it really isn't, and that kind of threw me off. But after getting used to it, like doing everything after the time skip, that's where I feel like I was really starting to appreciating it and actually enjoying it. And as for the story, yeah, I actually really like the story in this one. I think it has a pretty interesting take from the third game, but does its own thing with it in a unique way. And it does have some pretty cool characters that I really like. But I personally think that the character Finiel probably has like the most like character development though. Not to say that no one else does, but I think she probably improved the most over time throughout the game. And I also really like the way how they did the world building of this game with like trying to establish all like the politics within like the different like countries and how they work and how the PMB comes into establishment and all that kind of stuff. I actually all thought it was very interesting. My only complaint with the story, and it's not a huge complaint, is that I do find there were some parts in like the mid part of the game that I thought were a little bit too predictable, but they tried playing it off as if it was some big twist, and I was just like, yeah, I knew you were gonna be a fucking dickhole. But that's pretty minor though, because I do find that all the rest of the stuff is pretty good shit, and I really do like all the characters overall. There are just some of them I do like better than others, but overall I do think all of them are pretty consistently good. But probably one interesting thing about this game that kind of surprised me was actually the game's difficulty. I actually found this game to be like the easiest one compared to all the other games. I don't know if it's just because like the battle system is like kind of different or whatever, but I don't know, there's something about this game that I didn't find it to be as much as a struggle as some of the other ones, because, you know, the second game was hard because like it was like one of those where the fuck do I go kind of games, and it was also really confusing on where you're supposed to do at certain points. But then you got the fourth game, which was mostly hard because of like, you know, the amount of grinding you had to do in order to get like the good shit, and of course there were just some missions in that game that were a little bit on the frustrating side. And that's not to say that this game didn't have frustrating missions. It does have some, but I didn't feel like there wasn't nearly as many. And also the fact that this game, like, doesn't really have a whole lot of grinding you gotta do. Of course, grinding doesn't hurt, but I feel like even if you don't grind that much, you can still manage through most of the missions no problem, as long as you know what you're doing. And for that reason, I think I actually would say that this probably is the most beginner-friendly game in the series. The only thing is that's going to be a deciding factor is that, do you like games like Final Fantasy XII or Xenoblade or, you know, any other type of like active time-based action games? Yeah, something around those lines. I don't want to call them like action RPGs because, you know, when I think of those, I think of like Tales and, you know, Star Ocean, stuff like that. But anyways, yeah, you know, those types of games. If you like that type of shit, then you'll probably really like this game. And if not, well, then yeah, obviously you won't like it. And to keep in mind as well about the battle system for this game is that if you do start playing this one and you really like it and you want to jump into the other ones, there is a chance that, you know, you may not even like the other games. But I can say that if you do want, like, a sort of, like, active time-based RPG type game that is actually not super hard, but does have some interesting challenges, and does have a really good story and whatnot, then I would recommend it. I actually do think it's a really good game. Alright, so two things I gotta mention before we end it here is that, so there's only 2 games left in the series that I haven't reviewed yet, and that being the first game, which is on PS1 and also does have a PSP release, and it was Japan only, and then there's also the 6th game, which is also on PS2, and it's actually a direct sequel to this game, which hasn't been fan translated yet, but it actually is in the works though, so hopefully one day, whenever it gets done, and if I'm in the mood to play it, then I'll be able to do it. And that's partly the reason why it took me a while to get into this one. But yeah, hopefully one day I'll be able to review the last 2. Now, as for the last thing, so this is like my ranking of like the 4 games that I've played and reviewed so far. I can say that the second game is really good, but it's mostly good for the story and the gameplay. The way how you have to progress through the story, I think, is way overly complicated and just really confusing and a little frustrating, so for that reason, I think I actually kind of would say is like probably my least favorite out of like all of the games that I've played. And as for the third game, I would put that one above the second one because I do think the gameplay in it is a lot better. Like, you know, it actually has like a world map and everything. The only thing is that I don't think the story is on the same level as the second game, but it's still really good in its own way, and it still does have its good characters. But I'd say my favorite character in it would have to be Monica though. And of course, I have to mention that the character Hugh is still like the corniest character ever made. And as for the last 2, with being this one and the 4th game, well, I gotta be honest, I think I kinda like this one to be like my second favorite. Yeah, I think I still like the 4th game a little bit more than this one, but I do think there is a couple things that the 5th game does do better though. For an example, there's not nearly as much grinding you have to do, and the game didn't have nearly as much pain in the ass missions, but it still has a couple of them. But the thing that I give the edge to the 4th game though, is that not only do I think like a lot of like the extra stuff, like the graphics and the music are like way better than the 5th games because, you know, it actually has 2D sprites and it has like a pretty big OST and it has like a lot of like variety and great soundtrack overall. but I kinda like the characters overall in the 4th game better than the one in 5. Even though 5 definitely has its great characters, but I do think that the 4th one, I think it has more characters that I would consider to be big favorites, but I think that's more of a personal preference. Well, actually, to be fair, I think this entire ranking thing is a personal preference, but, you know, you get the point. Also, another thing that I didn't mention yet is that I find that, like, the choices that you make in the 4th game, I feel like a lot of them actually matter, and there's a lot of, like, cool things you can do. Like, you can actually, like, save people's lives, or you can, like, get people killed, and it'll actually change different directions of the story, which I thought was really cool. But in Growlanser 5, unfortunately, you don't get any of that, and I feel like a lot of the choices that you make in that one, they don't really, like, matter too much. At least they don't make, like, any huge impact or anything. Plus, there's a lot more characters that you can mess around with in the 4th game, so I feel like that the 4th game has a lot more replay value, more so than the 5th one, so that's another reason why I would still say that's my all-time favorite one in the series so far. But the 5th game is still very good overall, and I can still recommend it if it does sound interesting to you. So yeah, that's all I'm gonna say here, and holy shit, 30-minute video? Damn, wasn't expecting it to be like that. But hopefully this will be good enough information for you guys to, you know, be able to, like, decide which one you want to get into first if you haven't played a Growlanser game yet, but you've always known about it. Or you're just here just to hear, like, a fresh take on it, since, you know, I'm always playing these games for the first time and like to give out my thoughts on them, and, you know, they're just my thoughts, you know, they're not, like, authorized bullshit. So, with that said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.
Time for some supersonic speed!